Well, it's a wonderful, bright blue morning, and I wanted to ask you, as your grandson, um, why is it that you would like to speak to your grandchildren?
Well, I wished that I had asked my grandparents questions, but I didn't. And all I know about them is what I happened to pick up, like from other adults talking. And so I would just like to leave um, all that I know on record for my grandchildren.
Wow, that's awesome. And where did you get the idea to do this from?
Well, just because I like history, some people don't. My mother didn't. She said, "What in the world does it matter to you?" Well, all those old people did. But I've always just loved hearing stories about American history and even European history, and I've had a desire to know what happened before I was born.
Ah,
And I always seemed like I was too young for anything, like I was born too late. But now I realize all the people older than me are already gone and I'm still here. And so I should leave a record for my grandchildren of everything that they might want to know.
right, right, right. Now, I suppose you could think back to your own grandparents as well.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of right now.
And what was it like when you were small and you?
Well, of course, everybody has four grandparents. One of mine died before I was born, so I don't have any personal recollection of him. His name was Philip Winburn, and I know that he was 5 years old during the Civil War, way back in the American Civil War. And I understand that he took an important message on a white horse from one point to another, and he got through all right because he was a child, they didn't bother him.
Ah, interesting.
That's all I know about him. Oh, I do know that his father was a slave owner in Kentucky, but he freed his slaves and formed a company to fight on the side of the North.
Mm,
For whatever reason, he was for the North.
interesting.
Mhm.
And so I suppose when you were young, you didn't think of it, but you may have wanted to talk more with your
Oh,
grandparents.
I should have, because my grandmother, I'm sure, knew much more about him, than I did. Now, there's one thing that it pertains today. One of my grandchildren was scolded by a black person saying that his ancestors were slave owners and were the black person was very critical. And and my grandson didn't know this at the time, but I said, you could have said, no, my great grandfather freed the slaves, formed a company, and fought on the part of the North
Ah, wow.
to free the slaves.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so you don't need to have to, you know, feel like you are from ancestors that were on the slavery side. No,
Mm,
they were on our ancestors were on the side of freedom.
wow, that's great. I love it. Well, anything you'd like to say as a uh, beginning towards what you would like to talk about in subsequent videos?
Well, and subsequent, there will be a lot, but I'm still talking about my grandparents.
Hmm.
On the other side of the family, my dad's side, the Carlson side, of course, they all took their father's first name and put son on the end for their last name. So
Mm.
some were Anderson, some were Peterson, and my dad was Carlson. And he said I should have been Richardson, but in the United States, that custom died out.
Ah,
And so, anyway, his parents came to the United States from southern Sweden, and we think that there was a famine at that time.
mm,
And because everybody came, the whole family, mother, father, brothers, sisters, they were all adults. They all came over, and I think Gloria knows the name of the ship and everything. Gloria's is Caleb's mother, one of my daughters,
ah,
and all I know is they came and settled in Minneapolis, which was a very Scandinavian place. And it was much like Sweden, cold winters and lakes, and a lot of Swedish people and other Scandinavians uh, came to Minnesota.
Interesting.
But those grandparents died when I was 7. First the grandfather, and then a few months later the grandmother. So I never really had a relationship with them. I knew them. I mean, I visited them. I know what they looked like, but I was a very small child and I never talked to them or anything. I know that my grandmother had a leg amputated and walked on crutches, and she was very, very small. I think she was under 5 feet tall, and her sons picked her up and carried her, or else she walked on crutches.
Mm.
And the father, Edwin Carlson, was a big, strong man who was a carpenter and perhaps accident prone because he'd lost the tips of several fingers and one eye.
Oh my.
So anyway, and he was kind of a gruff person, I remember. And I remember he said, "Hop, hop, hop, hop," and uh, and I called him Beepa. That's where we got the name Beepa because they must have said, "This is your grandpa." And he was big. He wasn't so tall, but he was broad and muscular. And I thought his name was Beepa, Big Pa. I was trying to say Big Pa.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go over it again. You have four grandparents. Um, Tell me their names one more time.
Okay, my Swedish grandparents were Edwin and Christina. Actually, she was Ingrid Christina.
Okay,
Oh,
Edwin and Ingrid Christina. Okay,
mhm. And they were born in the 60s. I mean, I should say 1860s.
okay.
That was during the Civil War here in the United States, but they were born in Sweden.
Mm, okay.
And they emigrated as adults and came to Minnesota and lived in Minneapolis. And my grandfather found work, and they had one, two, three. I think they had 4 sons. I think there was a baby who died that I didn't really know much about. And their oldest son committed suicide at 17 years old. He was in love with a girl, and they wouldn't let him have a relationship with her, and they sent him up to North Dakota to work for an aunt and uncle on a farm, and he went out in the haystack and shot himself. And that
Why do you think he shot himself?
because of grief, because they wouldn't let him be with the girl he loved.
Ah,
And he was of an artistic temperament. He was an artist,
what was his name? Do you remember?
Oscar.
Oscar.
And I believe my sister Dorothy inherited that artistic bent. I certainly
Mm,
didn't. I'm not artistic at all,
mm.
but that's all I know about that. And then my dad was the next one in the family, and then I had an uncle Eddie who was a fireman.
Right. Okay, but let's keep it on the topic of your grandparents.
All right.
Now you've mentioned Ingrid, Christina, and Edwin, which were your Swedish grandparents on your father's side. Now, what about your mother's side?
Okay. Well, the one was Philip, who died. I think of stomach cancer when I was. Oh, I wasn't even born yet. I think he died in 1925, 5 years before I was born. But the grandmother on that side was Ella et Kelly, and then when she married, she was Winburn, and she was the closest grandparent to me, and she lived with us for many, many years, and I had a wonderful relationship with her. She especially liked me, and she taught me to knit and crochet and do quilts and even tat, which is sort of a lost art,
Mm,
and um, and I listened to soapbox operas with her.
really? What's a box
It was
opera?
15-minute programs, um, mostly sponsored by soap companies, and um,
Um,
and they were continued stories. There were little dramas that lasted 15 minutes minus the commercials, and then you had to listen every day to know what was going to happen.
mm.
And there were many, many every 15 minutes a different one.
So like a telenovela
Yeah,
in Spanish.
yeah. Only it was on the radio, and my mother didn't believe in it. Of course, she thought it wasn't Christian, and but she couldn't prevent her mother from watching it or from listening, and I would hide behind the couch and listen.
soap soap operas.
Soapbox cereals, they were
Oh,
called.
soapbox cereals. Interesting.
Cereals as SIE, what do you, cereals, not CEARLS.
Not the
Yes.
cereal that you eat, but a
No.
cereal like a series.
Yeah.
I see. Now that's funny because getting on your soapbox is also used as a term to get up and speak in front of people.
And that was my dad. He actually had a soapbox and just put it on the street corners and preached.
That's good. And he was the one that was very against listening to novels and
Oh yeah, he didn't
series.
like any fiction. No.
I see. Well, we can get further into that, but I feel like
Yeah, we need to
we
go
need
back
to.
to my grandmother.
Yes.
And she was born earlier. She was born in 1950. No, 18. Why do I say 19? Eight, she was born in 1857,
Uh-huh.
and
Wow, that's a long
she
time ago.
was born in Honeoye, New York. And when she was 8 years old, her family came west in a covered wagon,
Mm.
and they bought property in Minnesota, not too far north of Minneapolis. I used to know the spot, but I've forgotten.
Mm.
And they bought it from a family. My grandfather and my uncle, I mean, it would have been my great grandfather and my uncle, went there and negotiated the sale. And then they went to Honeoye, New York, and they put all their money into sheep.
Mm.
And they drove the sheep along with the covered wagon. And then they were going to sell the sheep and pay for the farm. And
Mm.
when they got there, the Indians had massacred that family. They were all dead, and
Mm.
their bodies were still there, blood all over the house, and their heads on fence posts.
Oh, wow.
And so that was a trouble, gruesome thing.
Was that in New York, you say?
No, that was in Minnesota, just north of
Oh,
Minneapolis.
right. Okay. In Minnesota.
And and then my grandfather, I think, was very sharp on business. It was my great grandfather actually, and he sold his sheep, and he got the check on dated on Sunday, and it was no good
Oh, my.
because you couldn't do any business on Sunday in those days, and so he lost all his money, but he still got the farm because the people were dead that owned it, and so they just took over the farm. They had to bury the people and clean up the mess. My grandmother said it was just terrible. I think it was my mother that told me that, that her grandmother. Oh dear, we're getting so mixed up over the generations. But the mother of the family that came from Honeoye, New York, in the covered wagon had to scrub the floors and clean up the blood and and make the house livable for her family.
Mm.
I know there were older boys, two or three older boys from a previous marriage, and then in my grandmother's siblings that were actually double siblings, mother and father. She had Emma, Etta, Elva, and then she was Ella.
Emma, Eva, Ella, and Etta.
And then they had more children, but they didn't keep on with the E's. They had Minnesota,
Ah.
who they called Minnie, and they had Jenny, and they had another one that they didn't name. They just called her Dolly. And when she got old enough, she chose Lillian as a name, but nobody ever called her Lillian. It's amazing that I even know it.
Wow.
But she was always Aunt Dolly.
Okay. Quite interesting. Now, we've talked about your four grandparents. Now, there's so much more we could go into. I think this would be great for jumping on and segueing into more in depth topics on each one of these things you've mentioned. But for now, we've done a brief overview,
Yes,
and we're planning on coming back and talking more specifically
yes, that's
based
right.
on what your grandkids respond and what they would like to know more about.
Yeah,
We can continue asking you more questions.
right.
And um, what's interesting to me is that I'm talking with my grandmother, and you're talking about your grandmother. So we're multiplying it about 5 generations, 6 generations back, all
Right.
the way back to 1850 something. But what would be interesting is, what did your grandmother tell you about her grandmother? Then we'd be going way back.
Nothing. That's the trouble. I wish I had talked to her about it, but she didn't tell me anything, and I
Ha!
never asked.
Ha! So that's lost.
Yeah.
So that's one reason why it's a good idea to talk with you now, so
Hmm.
that all of these things you know don't get
Yeah,
lost,
that's
and we
right.
can remember and learn from them.
And on the other side of the family, my dad's side of the family, I know nothing. I only know what I observed as a 7-year-old child
Um,
because we never talked.
mm, no good. We need to talk more.
Mhm.
Okay, so in summary, on your father's side, your grandparents' names were Edwin and Ingrid Christina. And on your mother's side, your grandmother's name was Ella et Kelly. And what was your father's name? Philip? I mean, your
My
grandfather?
grandfather was Philip Winburn.
Philip Winburn. So those are your four grandparents.
Oh, I do know something else.
Go ahead.
But this comes from Gloria, your mother's research,
Okay.
that that my grandmother's Ella Ett's um, father's family. This is about the Kellys,
Hmm.
and John Kelly had 10 children,
Hmm.
and his wife died. And instead of taking care of his 10 children, he went off and married a new wife with 3 children, and had more children.
Hmm.
And so Gloria came across a newspaper article saying, "What are we going to do with these Kelly children? They're running wild all over town."
Oh, wow.
And I don't know what they ever did with them, but since Ella Ett's father William was one of the younger children, we think he was adopted, and we know that he became a pastor, and we think he might have been a circuit riding minister because the few stories I know about him and his wife, the wife was always left alone with the children, and he was off somewhere, so that would sound like a circuit rider.
So the one you say was possibly a circuit rider. He was a son of Ella et Kelly.
No, he was the father of
Oh,
Elad
he was the
Kelly,
father. Oh, okay.
but that's very shady, very hazy from Gloria's research into um, family history.
Ah, I see. I see. Okay, quite interesting. Well, each one of these things can be focused on more, and
Yeah,
we will do so more.
I just want to say that I did know that little bit,
Yeah, I like that. That's so interesting to learn about our ancestors.
and that's all I know about those people.
Ah, I see. I see. All right. Well, then next time we'll talk more about things that are interesting to your grandkids. I'm going to share this video with them, and I'll ask them what kind of things they would like to ask you,
Hmm.
and we'll continue making one video every week,
Okay,
Lord willing.
very good.
All right. As a goodbye, what would you like to say to your
Well,
grandkids?
I'm happy for this opportunity, and I'm glad that you're listening to it, and I hope you have interest. I mean, some people just don't have any, and others do.
All right. And with that, we'll say goodbye for now.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.